Hi, I'm Jane Doe, and today I'll be talking to you about the single most important contribution of the French in the entire history of the world ever, their pivotal involvement in the American War for Independence circa 1778. So the American Revolution came about due to a great many factors, but one result of the French and Indian War, the American theater of the worldwide 7 Years' War, fought between a bunch of European nations from 1754 to 1763, sticks out as being basically the main cause. The war lasted for 9 years in total, despite the name, with the British standing as victors of the conflict. In the negotiations that followed, Britain received a bunch of land from France, which it promptly denied the colonists with the Proclamation of 1763, banning them from migrating into the new territory. Needless to say, the colonists were not happy about that. But what's more, what really had an impact is the fact that the war, being as most wars are, incredibly expensive, basically bankrupted Britain. This ended a long and happy period of salutary neglect on Britain's part. Parliament decided that since the war had been fought for the colonies, by God, they should pay for it. Many of us like to think the American Revolution was fought for the American dream of paying as few taxes as possible. And the rest of us like to think the American Revolution was fought for political ideals, life, liberty, and rainbows. But the truth is, well, I mean, taxes do suck. Though some colonists have been trying to unite the colonies since the beginning of the French and Indian War, most notably Ben Franklin, #JoinOrDie. So it's not like the idea hadn't been around, but as Parliament began to spew acts into the leadership of Lord George Grenville, not to be confused with all of the other Grenvilles, the idea began to garner more support from the population. It started in 1764 with the Sugar Act, then the Currency Act, then 1765 with the Stamp Act and the Quartering Act. These all had direct and not positive consequences on the colonists. And what's more, they had no way of influencing them due to their lack of representation in Parliament. The Quartering Act literally made colonists house and feed British soldiers who'd been there since the end of the French and Indian War. And the colonists couldn't, go and talk to their representative and get them to swing some votes around and change that because they didn't have one. The colonists began to kick up such a fuss. A member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry, for one, gave a rousing speech against the acts that ended with, "If this be treason, make the most of it," and went on to drag the rest of the Virginia House of Burgesses into making a bunch of radical resolutions dismissing the Stamp Act in its entirety. Such fusses convinced Parliament to repeal the acts and replace them with the Declaratory Act in 1766, which basically just said, "We can totally tax you if we want, OMG." And so, the following year, the British proved that they could, indeed, tax the colonists. Charles Townshend drafted the aptly named Townshend Revenue Act to do just that. The economy took a turn for the down and the colonists protested. By 1773, the duties were all repealed, with the exception of one, the Tea Act. At the time, tea was as important a commodity as coffee is today, and while the act lowered the tax on tea imported from Britain, it also made smuggled tea, which was 90% of what colonists drank, much more difficult to acquire and possess. Months later, a patriot, or pro-independence, group made up of skilled artisans, laborers, and seamen, the Sons of Liberty, dumped what amounts to over $1 million worth of tea into the ocean in the Boston Tea Party. As it turns out, they were very considerate about it, even sweeping the decks of the ships when they finished. Britain was not impressed by their conscientious protesting, and responded with what would come to be called the Intolerable Acts, which blockaded Boston's ports and took away Massachusetts' right to self-govern, even going so far as to make Quebec, which was under British control at the time, bigger, and to give their Catholics more rights. Just how could they? Meanwhile, in England, Benjamin Franklin, who was by far the most well-known American outside colonial borders, famous for his scientific findings, and inventions, and writings, was convincing a rather radical fellow by the name of Thomas Paine to migrate to the Americas and set up shop as a journalist, eventually leading him to write one of the most influential pamphlets in U.S. history, Common Sense. Paine's simple language and hilarious arguments convinced many the patriot cause was a just one, with such gems as, "One of the strongest natural proofs of the folly of hereditary right in kings is that nature disapproves it. Otherwise, she would not so frequently turn it into ridicule by giving mankind an ass for a lion." Franklin returned to the colonies with Paine to attend the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, 1774, as delegate of Pennsylvania, along with a great many of our founding fathers to be, with the exception of anyone from Georgia, because they all skipped. They basically decided to ask King George III to cease all this intolerable acts of nonsense, saying Americans cannot submit. When he refused to retract them, they called a Second Continental Congress in 1775 to organize protection for the colonies. They appointed George Washington general of a ragtag Continental Army, and in 1776 they adopted the Declaration of Independence, and Britain declared the colonies in rebellion. But the Second Continental Congress also decided to send diplomats abroad. Most importantly, they sent Benjamin Franklin to France in the hopes of getting the French to fund their war and join the fight. Franklin made a superb diplomat for a few reasons. Firstly, as I've mentioned before, he was super famous, and he had lots of connections in intellectual circles from his previous days in London and Paris. He also spoke French, which helped, and furthermore, he understood, unlike his fellow diplomat, the notoriously uptight John Adams, that to deal with the French, you had to do as the French did. He was amazing, like amazing, at forging informal alliances with parties and like sleeping around as needed. It helped that the French were still prickly over their loss to Britain in the 7 Years' War. They'd started funding the Continental War effort secretly as soon as it began, thanks to Pierre Beaumarchais and some shady Portuguese companies for just that reason. It's a good thing they had, too, because if they hadn't, General Washington wouldn't have even had the supplies necessary to last the first year of the conflict and make it so he could, camp out at Valley Forge in 1777 with von Steuben. Nonetheless, the French monarch, King Louis XVI, was unwilling to declare open war with the British, probably for fear of losing again to Britain's not indomitable navy. Then, in October 1777, the Patriots won the Battle of Saratoga. This battle was special. The Continental Army managed to successfully surround British General Burgoyne's invading force from Canada and force him to surrender it. This was the first decisive American victory, and it proved to be enough for Franklin to convince the French government to openly declare war and lend their full aid to the American Revolution. In February 1778, France became the first nation to officially recognize the United States of America as a sovereign nation with this signing of the Treaty of Alliance. To quote French General Marquis de Lafayette in a letter to his wife, whose clothes he'd borrowed to disguise himself as a woman so he could run away from his aristocratic duties and join the revolution in the first place, "My presence is more necessary to the American cause than you would imagine." And it was true. Like, apart from contributing huge amounts of food, munitions, soldiers, and just straight up money, the French Navy fought the British Navy, which was something the US, having no navy to speak of, couldn't hope to contend with. By engaging British ships in the Caribbean, for example, the French fleet opened up a whole new theater in the war and hugely diverted British forces, by forcing them to stretch thin to try and protect the Sugar Islands. Thin enough that when Spain joined the fray, things were really not looking very good for the British. After a string of US and French victories in 1780 and 1781, the combined forces of the Continental Army, the French fleet, and the French army, led by General Washington, Comte de Grasse, and Comte de Rochambeau, respectively, began the siege of Yorktown. They won a final, decisive victory, forcing British Lord Lieutenant General Lord Cornwallis to surrender with his troops on October 19th, 1781. And afterward, the British finally opened up to negotiations. But Benjamin Franklin was a sneaky fellow, and he didn't tell the French that the US was negotiating with the British following the siege of Yorktown. So France didn't actually end up gaining much when the war formally ended in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, only regaining some territories lost in the French and Indian War. It did win a solid propaganda victory, bolstering its international esteem, but funding the war put such a strain on France's finances, as they'd spent upwards of $1 billion overall, and the colonial theater alone raised its national debt by more than, like, I don't know, just a lot. Just like, what, more than a third? Yeah, it was more than a third. And Jacques Necker was so bad at being finance minister of France that not long after the American Revolution drew to a close, the French Revolution began to emerge, and that one was much, much more violent. So this made foreign relations between the two nations kind of tense. Some of the tension there was due to the ambiguity of the military alliance between the nations following the Treaty of Paris, which hadn't explicitly ended the alliance, and the US, being a shiny new nation, was really nervous about getting dragged into some other country's conflict so soon after ending its own. And then, after adopting the Constitution in 1788, the Articles of Confederation, as I'm sure you remember, sucked, the U.S. split politically into two parties. The Federalists, who being elitist merchants and bankers, preferred to ally with the British, and the Jeffersonians, who being all about ideals and liberty and farming, wanted to align with the U.S. with the French and assist with their revolution. George Washington, first President of the United States, was loosely Federalist in his domestic policy, mainly due to his extremely active Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who led it. But in foreign affairs, he stressed neutrality above all, saying, "A passionate attachment of one nation for another produces a variety of evils." So unsurprisingly, when the French asked for U.S. assistance in dealing with its revolutionaries, the U.S. politely declined involvement. They wouldn't return the favor for, France bankrupting itself, helping us become a nation for another century and a half or so. Sorry, France.